Recently, a friend gave me 2 offcuts of oak worktop.
Thank you.
It had been stored in a cold outbuilding for a few years, so unfortunately there were some signs of delamination, which I'll have to deal with later.
So I'm not a massive fan of these oak worktops that are made up of 40mm staves of oak, finger jointed together at the ends. So I've had an idea to convert this into an end grain top instead, which I think could be interesting.
I squared up the ends using the track saw, and then I made a simple jig by overlapping 2 offcuts of MDF, which is going to allow me to position my track a repeatable distance from that straight edge. And I'm aiming to make my top about 65mm thick. As you'll see as I'm making the cuts, those delaminated areas are going to cause me some issues. At the moment you'll see I've got quite a lot of repetition in grain, so I'm going to vary it up by moving things around and rotating pieces to get a more random pattern. Now it was inevitable that a few of those finger joints were going to get cut through, and this is how that looks. So I checked each of the pieces and I'll rotate any finger joints so that they're on the underside wherever possible. I did have 1 or 2 pieces that had finger joints cut through on both sides, so those got removed entirely. Before I glue anything up, I'm going to sand each face with some 80 grit. I want to clean up these faces just to make sure that I get good adhesion. And then I can start gluing them up in sections, and wherever there were bits that had delaminated, I tried to re-glue them at this point, and then I got everything clamped down, first to my workbench top to make sure that the glue up is nice and flat, then all of the pieces get clamped together, and then across the length as well, just to close up any gaps from those delamination problems. After a few hours I can get each section out of the clamps. I'm going to try running these pieces through the thicknesser. I've never done this with end grain before, and generally it isn't considered good practice to do this. It's much riskier than planing face grain because the knives in the planer could tear out the grain really badly, so you could end up ruining your workpiece, or even worse, the workpiece could break into pieces and potentially damage your planer, or even damage you, as pieces could fly out at you at some force. A safer option would be to use a belt sander with an aggressive grit like 40 or 60. But I'm going to take a couple of precautions when trying this. Firstly, I'm going to put a fresh cutting edge on my planer knives to make sure they are as sharp as possible for a clean cut. And secondly, I'm only going to take very light passes, removing a tiny amount of material with each pass. I'm also going to make sure I'm standing to one side because I don't want to be in the firing line of the machine if anything goes wrong. This actually worked great, really nice clean cuts. I got a bit of tear out at the end of the cuts, which I expected, but that doesn't matter because I'm going to need to cut the edges anyway. With that end grain nice and clean and true, before I glue up each section together, I want to make sure that the surfaces are square to the end grain faces and also perfectly straight too. So I set up the planer fence and planed the edges. You'll see here that when I did the first glue up, I made sure to stagger all the joins just to maximise the strength structurally, and I'm going to stagger the glue lines again in this next glue up too. So I prepared to glue the sections together, figuring out an order which again randomises the grain pattern as much as possible. So this is glue up part 2, and you'll see that one of my sections isn't as long as the others, so I'm going to get this all in clamps and then try to fill the gaps with some of the spare bits and offcuts. I used a hand plane to get them fitting nice and snug, and then knocked them in place, making sure to get them as level as possible, and then securing with clamps. And then a few hours later, here's the last bit going in, which felt a little tight initially, so again a few adjustments with the hand plane to get it fitted. Once it was out of the clamps, unfortunately I did have a few gaps, again from more delamination occurring as a result of being under clamping force. So I cut some splices at the table saw from offcuts in various sizes so that I can glue these in place. And by the time these are cut off and sanded, no one's going to notice them. I got sent this new battery operated belt sander from Milwaukee, so this seems like a good time to try it out. I just need to get all of those new glue joints flush now that the workpiece is obviously too big to go through the planer again. I started with 80 grit and then marked up some lines and sanded again at 120. And then it was on to yet more sanding with the random orbital sander, 80, 120 and finally 180. I'm not going to have enough cutting depth with my track saw to do this in one go, so I needed to flip the workpiece in between cuts. And then clean up the edges with the belt sander. I added a nice round over to soften the edges, and then I finished with a bit of hand sanding. I say finish, but little did I know at the time that this actually wasn't as close to being finished as I first thought. I'll explain why shortly. I'm going to be using some pure tung oil on this for a few reasons. Firstly, it's food safe. Secondly, I watched a video by the Wood Whisperer recently where he explained that it's much more durable and hard wearing than other food safe finishes. And thirdly, it smells great.
Unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to sand this down and start again with applying finish because there are a few areas where I can still see some glue lines. So clearly I haven't sanded enough, even though I covered it in pen and then sanded it all down. I thought I'd got everything, but I haven't. I can also see some sanding scratches left by the belt sander here. Despite all that many hours of sanding, I think I'm going to have to sand it again.
This was my first time trying out these 3M extract discs. I spoke about these in my recent video about workshop gifts. Not sponsored or anything, but I was really impressed with their performance. They last much longer than the discs that I've used before, and they didn't clog up as much as I was expecting with all that oil finish either. Once I was absolutely certain that all of those blemishes were gone, it was on to finishing yet again. 3 coats of the oil in total, with a little bit of denibbing in between coats with some 400 grit wet and dry, and I applied the same finish to the bottom surface too, just to make sure that there are no issues with expansion and contraction. I'm going to apply a top coat of my own handmade oil wax finish. This is the food safe version, and it's going to provide extra protection, make it silky smooth to the touch, and add a little bit of sheen too, which I think will look nice. I'll leave links to this as well as the other products in the range in the description box below if you'd like to give it a try. I applied 2 coats in total and then gave it a really good buffing. This end grain butcher block top is going to be for a kitchen island that I'll be finishing off in a future video. I'm pleased with how it turned out and I think it looks much better than it did as an oak stave top. I hope you agree. Thank you for watching.